Hello, welcome to another UTS Startups Confessions. Okay, this is my first one of the year.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, I have no idea what I'm doing. This will be a fun one.
It's two of us.
People watching at home. And it, like, out of any interview that we've done, this is the most important for any startup founder or people working with startup founders, or this maybe future founders if you're thinking about what you do in the future. Because we're going to talk about what mistakes people make, especially from a legal perspective, how much money it costs them, the kind of impact it has on their lives, from someone who knows more in this area than any person I've ever met. So,
that's very kind, Murray.
Madeleine Boothe. I say Madeleine, it doesn't sound right. I call you Mads, but please welcome Madeleine Boothe.
Thank you.
Who, over the last 10 years, has worked with hundreds and hundreds of startups. I don't know any lawyer that has worked with more startups, especially early stage startups, than yourself. What's the number one mistake you've seen people make?
Oh, it's a tough one. I think the number one mistake, which is a good thing and a bad thing, but a lot of startup founders are extremely optimistic, very idealistic. They think they're going to change the world, disrupt an industry, which they, very many of them are. But I think that they often skip over the fact that issues may arise and what happens when those issues do arise, how to best address them and mitigate any fallout that might come from those issues. Which can then lead to very costly, time-consuming, and a lot of legal fees if lawyers need to get involved and things get nasty or unpleasant.
Yeah.
So I think that would be the biggest mistake, future-proofing your business in that way.
That's the thing. There was a question in Startup Muster around how did you decide the equity split in your company, and by far the most common was an equal split.
Yeah.
How does that work out for people when they do an equal split on day one with their best friend?
It can work out well, but more often than not it doesn't, purely because things change over time. Some founders will think, I've been putting in 10 times more hours than my co-founder, why should we get the same? It's also, some people's views change. Some people say, I've got the capabilities to drive this business for the next 3 years, but another founder maybe wants to settle down and have a family or has other things in mind, and so it's thinking about, okay, what happens at that point in time? How do we then address this? And is it fair that the founder for the first 2 years still gets 50% and there's another founder who's driving it towards the end?
And then investors walk in and say, who are these people in your shareholder going to list?
Yeah, that's right. That happens quite a lot. You might have heard of the term like cleaning up the cap table, which is something that people do before investment comes in, or sometimes investors ask for that because sometimes in the early days, if startups don't have a lot of money as well, you give shares to remunerate people. And so sometimes, you'll see all of these people that maybe worked for a couple of months here and there on your share register. And so investors are like, who are these Joe Blogs who's worked for 2 shares in the business? What are they doing when it's 10 years later? So. Okay.
So number one mistake is optimism.
Yeah, which is a good thing. And see, lawyers are the opposite because we think of what's the worst thing that can happen. So we're on the pessimistic side. So we try and share some of that insight into what may be able to go wrong, may go wrong.
No, but it sounds cheaper to fix on day one than down the track, to have like people earning their equity and this asking yourself the question of what happens if this doesn't work out with this person. Is there something else people should do?
It's a really good question. I think, often like in any relationship, it's a lot easier to discuss hard things or what happens if something goes wrong when everybody is excited about the business, everything's really positive. You can talk about, well, what if I want to leave? What if you want to leave? What if we have a disagreement that we can't get over? What happens to the business? What happens to our shares? And so often a really good way to address that at the start is having either a co-founder agreement, a shareholders agreement is a really common way to deal with that as well. It actually sets out lots of different scenarios and what happens to the business and the shares if any of these situations arise, which is great if it doesn't arise, but you can just sign the document, put it in a drawer, and you don't need to look at that until something does go wrong. And then if something does go wrong, you just have a document to refer to, rather than both of you not talking to each other. There's a stalemate that happens. Lawyers get involved, and then obviously the cost goes up a lot, and it's going through lawyers instead of just saying, hey Maury, it didn't work out, but this is what we agreed to do. Let's try and make this as amicable as possible.
Okay. So let's move on to the kind of second big mistake. So for example, I'm working with my friend on something, we maybe haven't incorporated something yet, we're making some kind of software or whatever else. Maybe we have an unpaid intern that comes into the company that we kind of half-assedly register. What's gone wrong?
Don't tell me that part.
What's gone wrong in that situation?
So one of the big things there is that there's probably a leakage of intellectual property, because intellectual property is probably the biggest asset that you have, especially in a technology startup. And so you really want to do your best to identify that intellectual property so that you can protect it and ensure that it's not leaking out of the business, and you can maintain that and own that. So in that example, there's two founders or two business partners working in probably developing code, and software code is copyright. So copyright is the written expression of an idea. So anything that we write down, source code, designs, logos, drawings, business plans, anything like that. And so that is created at the time that it's written down, but it doesn't go anywhere unless there's a written document to say, I, Maddy Boothe, assign my copyright in this to Maury Herbst, or the company that we've both created. And so in that example, the IP just still sits with each of the founders and also with the intern. So the intern is probably creating marketing plans or social media or anything, but they actually own that until it's assigned to as a company or to someone else.
If I just pay them $50.
Pay them $50?
Or whatever amount is there an assumption of assignment?
No.
Okay.
There can be, but I think it's very messy and it's really hard to prove that. And then you have to then maybe go to court or try and establish that you have a right to that, which is implied. Whereas the best case and easiest case, most cost efficient, is to have a short document in place just to confirm that this is, I'm hiring you, you're doing this work for me, I'm going to pay you this amount, I get all of the intellectual property and assets that you create. And that's commonly seen in employment agreements, contractor agreements, services agreements, and for interns you have a short volunteer agreement or an intern agreement, and the same with the co-founders. You have a co-founder agreement or you have a shareholders agreement, or they're probably employed by the business as well, by the company as well.
Okay, and what goes wrong down the track, or what examples have you seen where that hasn't been the case?
So examples that I've seen would be often a lot of companies, if they're building a technology software or product, they'll get overseas developers to help out because it's cheaper and quicker and just easier. And often they have a services agreement, but there's no intellectual property assignment. So what happens is you get to a few years later even, and someone's coming in to maybe buy your business, or you've realised when you get full-time developers in that we don't actually own half of the platform that we've built or half of the product that we've built because we haven't had a proper assignment in place. And so it might be really hard to get an assignment later or try and fix any of those issues, and can be quite expensive. And it also just means that you've paid for something that you don't legally own the intellectual property rights to.
Okay.
Another example of this, actually, so my mum has a tutoring business, and she asked a designer to get a logo for her business, and she paid the money, and then she got the logo at the end, but then the fine print of the terms of the designer's terms said actually you only get a license to the logo, you don't actually own it. The designer retains the ownership rights, which means...
What a scam.
I know, but it means the designer can then put my mum's logo on her website. She can also then change it slightly and give it to other people. And so then I helped mum, of course, negotiate to make sure that she owned it. But that's a really common thing that happens, especially for a lot of creatives.
Okay.
So just being aware of these things and reading the T's and C's.
Okay, and on the topic of employees,
Yes.
Is there, what are the mistakes that people make in employing people?
What are the mistakes? I would say a few, but I think making sure that you, first of all, have proper documentation in place. So if you employ someone, you actually have an employment agreement with them that sets out, you're going to do this for me, I'm going to pay you this much, I'll get all of the intellectual property, confidentiality obligations and things in there as well. I think especially for a startup, you want to make sure everyone's keeping all the secrets in the business, because that's your competitive edge and that's how you're going to be able to disrupt the market. I think also with remuneration of employees is a big one, because a lot of the time cost is a really big constraint for startups, and maybe they can't afford to pay someone market rate that they're worth or that they would be able to get. And so they sometimes supplement that with sweat equity, as it's called, or shares or options in the company to be able to pay them. But I had a really unfortunate example of a client actually they had a virtual reality startup, and they hired all these awesome people, but they couldn't afford to pay them full market rate. They actually hired them as more junior, and as time went on, so their employment agreement they signed as maybe like a junior designer, but as time went on they became more senior, started taking on more responsibility, as you do in a startup. You wear about 25 hats, and as that happened they were just paying them sort of a small amount in cash or in remuneration, and then some shares in the business. And the founders thought because the business was worth $10 million or whatever it was worth, that the shares that the employee got meant that their total package was really high, and so it was above minimum wage. But when the employee, lots of things happened, but they got really disgruntled about not being treated right, which is another key thing to think about. But they made a complaint to Fair Work, and there was a big legal dispute which ended up costing significantly more money for the startup than if they had paid them a bit more. But the Fair Work settlement happened that it didn't count as remuneration, the shares that you give to someone, or there was options in this case. So that was a really unfortunate example, because the cost of the legals and then what they had to repay the employee, which was superannuation, unpaid entitlements, the salary, what she should have been paid, meant that the company actually went insolvent. So that was that's one of the worst case scenarios. But it's really making sure that you know your obligations as an employer, even though you're a startup. The law still does apply to you in some of these things, and so just really being aware of what your obligations are.
I think I can hear distant cries of startups.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I know plenty of other people doing this as well.
Yeah, so you're saying if I just pay people in equity alone, I'm not meeting the minimum wage requirement. Yeah,
the Fair Work Act, or the Fair Work Commissioner doesn't think that counts as.
But I can do it for my own company.
Well, your own company, if you're an employee, you still have the same obligations. So you still have to pay yourself minimum wage, but if it's just you, you're probably not going to dob on yourself to someone and get yourself in trouble. But if you're an employee, you still need to pay yourself the minimum wage of whatever that role is.
That's bizarre. It's like having workers' comp for yourself. But
yeah, a lot of people don't actually. If it's your own business, sometimes you won't employ yourself. You'll maybe just be paid as a director, or provide services to the business. Or there's different ways that you can structure your own arrangement. But I think this is really important for when you're hiring staff.
Okay.
But also yourself, because then you get leave and entitlements and things as well.
Yeah, that'd be good. And especially if someone else ends up owning the company and you want arrangements to make sense for you as an employee, maybe. But talking about that kind of exit pathway thing, are there things that people should think about on day one in terms of future exits, and what kind of mistakes have you seen there?
Yes, that's a very good one. I think, another really good thing, or really, really important thing for startups, is thinking about the end in mind. So actually thinking about, even when you're really early stage, thinking about what an exit looks like. Is your plans to be acquired by a big technology company or a competitor? Are you planning to IPO? Do you just want to have this as a lifestyle business to make some money, or maybe even a side hustle? And thinking about that, because that will help structure your business and you'll be able to change that over time. I think thinking about that from day one is really important, and will also save you a significant amount of costs and capital gains tax, or all different things if you need to change that structure, especially if it's at the end when you're thinking about exiting. So
give me a kind of terrifying story of someone that's messed it up.
A terrifying story. Well, this one had a happy ending at least, but I had a client and they were a real estate business, and they started their startup, just 3 friends, they were bootstrapping, really, really successful. They built it up, and over 8 years, just working away and making good amounts of money. But then they got a knock on the door, an offer that was too good to refuse, to come and buy their business from a large US private equity firm. And so, changed their lives sort of offer. But unfortunately, there was 8 years of dirty laundry that they needed to fix up, which just meant that, there was things like leases that weren't properly assigned. There was loans to directors and things that were just all over the place. There was like IP assignments that weren't signed. There was employees that had come and gone that didn't have a contract. There was, it was just all the things that you think about, which wasn't an issue for them at the time because they had really good relationships with all those people. But it was more when they were going through due diligence as part of a sale that the private equity firm, goes through with a fine-tooth comb and looks over your whole business. And they usually give you a checklist. They usually give you, a list of things that you need to tell them about what's happened. And what that means is that they can drive down the valuation of your company the more things that are missing or the more things that they deem are risky, which is if you don't have a signed contract, that's a risk because that person might come back and make a claim. Or if there's part of the business that's not owned, then the same thing could happen. So in this example, it was 3 months of basically us as full-time trying to fix up all of these issues with the company, which is again a massive expense to a startup or any company. But also the deal almost fell over a few times because the buyer was saying it's taking too long to get us this. Are you hiding something? What's going on? But it was just us trying to rush as fast as we can to get all this stuff done. But yeah, it just means that if you get a knock on the door, you might not be sale ready, or you might not be ready to do that thing. So it's just trying to think about that.
So I think there's an obvious case for making sure you have legal support at the right moments. Have you seen cases of people getting the wrong advice from the wrong places, and in terms of startup-focused advice?
Yes, I think that's a common one. I think, people are thinking sort of one size fits all, or getting something that's maybe not fit for the startup's purpose, because usually startups are doing something that either hasn't been done before or isn't really that common, or it's quite innovative. And so there's not often just a template or download ChatGPT to sort of fix that. It might get you 80% of the way there, but it's always the 20% that's when the issues arise and that's when things go wrong. So I think either getting something that's not suited for you and just something quick and easy, or quick and cheap. Or otherwise on the other end, like getting advice which maybe isn't startup friendly, and it's getting advice which is actually too complicated for what the startup needs. If you're starting, you want to conserve the money that you have, and you want to put it in product, you want to put that in marketing, you want to put that in actually building up your business, rather than having a really complicated legal structure or business structure with companies and trusts and agreements going here and there between them, because that's actually not what you need at that point in your business. That might be you in 5 years' time. So, spending too much money at the start and getting something that's not suited to you, but also just trying to do it a bit maybe cheap, and then not getting something that's tailored towards protecting you and protecting the risks of your business.
So you're saying don't do it all on ChatGPT?
No, please don't do that.
Or spend lots of money at large firm?
Yes. Yep.
Okay, somewhere in between.
Somewhere in between.
Are there templates or other things that people can benefit from in terms of quick hacks to get things done?
There are. If I can give everyone in this, or whoever's watching, I've got a co-founder agreement, which I'm happy to send to anyone that's thinking about some of these things that we talked about. So, talking about those difficult issues up front and mapping out what happens if there's an exit plan. So I can share that with everybody after this.
That'd be good.
If that will help.
In the comments on each of these videos, on whatever platform you're watching on, we'll put the first comment from yourself of our email address for people to contact. Sound good?
Perfect.
Okay. And in LinkedIn, Facebook, whatever you're watching on, I think add other questions as well. I'm sure we can make those comment threads kind of interesting if you've got other kind of general legal questions without giving specific legal advice.
Yep, of course. Yep, happy to.
is to open it up. And like the reason for taking your time today is the amount of time you volunteered to so many startups to help kind of direct them in the right path, and how many people I know you have helped in doing that. So I'm sure you'll continue to do that for those people as well.
Oh, thank you. Yes, of course.
And wouldn't it be nice if they could watch this, 10 years ago?
Yeah, that's true.
But at least you get to watch it today. So we're going to get into the best part of this, which is the private Q&A, where all the juicy bits come out, and we'll get to hear some kind of more juicy stories that are not fit for recordings. But if you're watching at home, you won't get to see that. But come and join us every Friday at 3:30 at UTS Startups at Central for the next Confessions. But for now, join me in thanking Madeleine Boothe.
Oh, thank you.